welcome to Upasana Maniar's channel. As you all know, this is the second sequel in my series of loneliness versus isolation, and I have Miss Pragya Lodha with me. She is a clinical psychologist and is currently working with many mental health-based institutions. Hello, ma'am. Thank you so much for doing this.
Hi, Upasana.
How are you, ma'am?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm good as well. So, ma'am, today we're going to be talking about loneliness and isolation. More like a versus, we're going to be comparing the two things as there has been a lot of confusion as to what is the difference between them and the fact that they are not synonymous. So, ma'am, what are the first things that people should keep in mind when they hear about loneliness and isolation?
Right. Like how you very correctly said that loneliness and isolation are most often used interchangeably as terms, though they aren't the same. Loneliness, if we look at, is more of a feeling. It is something which is very subjective and at a feeling and emotional level, whereas isolation is a phenomenon where the person is actually physically or socially away from people. Isolation is most often called as also social isolation because we look at isolation, especially when we're comparing it to loneliness. Uh, we look at how isolation is a feeling that usually arises when people may have several relationships with other people, but the quality of those relationships is often not as effective, not as fruitful and meaningful to the person, which often makes the person feel lonely. Whereas isolation or social isolation is a phenomenon where the person may actually be away from people and may not have those kinds of relationships with other people. So one of the most important things to know, like in the beginning, like if as you asked that, if I had to say that what is the most important thing is that though both the terms are linked to one another, they both can be understood with each other complementarily. They are essentially different terms. For example, a good way to understand the difference between the two is that an individual may be surrounded by people, but the person still may feel lonely as a result of them not having an effective or a fruitful relationship with people around them. Versus for somebody who is socially isolated, is inevitably bound to feel lonely as a result of lack of presence of people. However, it does not always imply that social isolation or a person who may be socially isolated will always feel lonely. A person
Right.
can also choose to be socially isolated. So that would be the most essential difference between the two.
Okay. So the main takeaway from that discussion was that isolation is essentially being separate and alone, and loneliness is a mental state, more like a feeling of sadness, right, ma'am? So,
Right.
what I understand sometimes is that there is a thin line between them. Although there is allowance for common ground, it's more like it's two destinations, opposite destinations on the same route. So, why is this thin line fading away, or is more like ironical in today's sense?
Right. When we look at, when we previously saw that how social isolation or isolation and loneliness are different, the thing is, when we understand both the phenomenons, it's important that we look at the context in which we are understanding it.
Right.
For example, I may be a person, I may choose to get isolated, but most often people don't choose to be lonely, right?
Doesn't
I may be isolated. Sorry, Upasana, I didn't hear you.
So loneliness doesn't really leave much room for choice. Nobody would choose to be lonely, but someone would choose to
Yeah,
be.
yes. Most often people don't choose to be lonely. They may choose to be isolated, but they may feel still okay about it, not necessarily always lonely. Another thing is that now, if we look at a different context, say, suppose, let's maybe take the pandemic situation which is going on right now due to COVID-19. A lot of people are isolated without choice, which is also resulting in them feeling lonely. A
Right.
lot of people are maybe, stuck alone, living alone, have not been able to reach their families. They maybe stay in parts of the country or parts of the world where they do not have a lot of people known. A lot of students, a lot of people have had traveled or had just shifted to different countries and different places where they may not have a lot of known people. So over there, they are bound to feel socially isolated as well as also feeling lonely, right? So this is how context plays a very important role. Another thing which you will see, you will observe and read as well, is that isolation in general is also increasing a lot among the youth and the young adults, which is also leading to feelings of loneliness. Yet another explanation about loneliness, especially, would be that loneliness is also something that people feel when they are discriminated, where there is an enforced isolation. For example, you will read that most commonly youth and the elderly are the two groups of the population that usually tend to feel far more lonely than any other age group in the population. Another way to also understand is that there are several other groups who also tend to feel more lonely. For example, look at maybe refugees. For example, look at maybe patients with mental illnesses. People who are not very easily integrated within larger groups will tend to feel lonely as well. And that is loneliness that is also linked with sadness. Sometimes loneliness can also be experienced when a person is going through or suffering from a mental illness. So various other emotions are also clubbed with that experience of loneliness. So when you ask me, if I have to tell you maybe in summary that why is the line sort of blurring, because the thing is that isolation and loneliness both are increasing as phenomenon in different yet similar contexts as well. For example, one of the biggest examples of this context is the pandemic, that is the COVID-19 situation. Another example where you can see that isolation and loneliness both are increasing is when you look at the rate at which people are also leaving their families, their hometowns, to study better, to study ahead, to work further. So these are also some very obvious changes in lifestyle, which, whether we like it or not, but they do bring in social isolation in some form. So in those examples, it can be seen that there, yes, the two are increasing.
True, true, ma'am. So isolation and hence loneliness. That's one way we can put it, right? Isolation
In a
leads to
way,
loneliness,
yes.
but loneliness is a product of isolation.
Yes, but again, like I said, that the context really plays a role. That a person who may be socially isolated may not always feel lonely, whereas a person who's lonely also may not necessarily always be isolated. So, I may be surrounded in a group of people, I may be sitting with five people, I may not be isolated, but I may still feel lonely because I don't have a relationship with the people sitting around me. So, yes.
So, ma'am, as you mentioned earlier, this pandemic hasn't really left much choice in the case of isolation. Being with your own self for more than 2 months, and you're left with nothing but your conscience and your own, the voice of your own head, and it's really, it's airing. More importantly, it's frightening to an extent, and all these different fears and pains of your past that you somehow managed to repress are resurfacing today. Even before the widespread and the mandatory impositions of this pandemic, there were people who went through similar stuff. But now that this has got a global momentum, people are giving more importance to it. People are kind of looking at it as another epidemic.
Right.
right? So, do you think that this global effect of it has brought it under this decade-old concern under the spotlight?
Well, in a way, Upasana, we definitely, I mean, being a mental health practitioner, we all have realized that the pandemic has been a time where I think everyone has got enough time to think, experience, and not run away from what they are experiencing. And in our practice, we've seen that a lot more people have reached out for help. A lot of distress has arisen among people as a result of this global pandemic. A lot of people who had pre-existing problems have had exaggerated problems during this time as well. So different dynamics, we've seen during this pandemic. But one thing that I would maybe like to note and let people know is that a very important thing that I've been emphasizing on ever since the beginning of this pandemic is that it's important that we have got this time and we can really learn to become comfortable with ourselves, because especially when we look at the youth, the young adults, they do find it extremely difficult to find peace with themselves, because on our day-to-day basis and routines we are constantly occupied with something or the other. So we're barely and rarely left with any amount of time to really sit with ourselves, think, address our problems. And now that we've got it, well, it definitely has come with an overwhelming feeling. But I think it's been more for the good, I would say, for a lot of people who've actually come ahead, stepped out, and reached out for help as well. So, one of the things that we have to take away from this pandemic situation is that it has brought to us a realization that mental health is important. Being comfortable under your skin is an important just practice, in general, for well-being. So let's maybe not just limit it to the pandemic duration, but I think let's take it ahead so that we're able to maintain our well-being for a longer period of time on a long-term basis.
Yes, that's true. We have to learn to live in solitude, be comfortable with ourselves, and handle solitude. And once we learn to grace solitude, I think it does wonders to us, because I have experienced it. I've learned to be with myself, and I think it's really worth it for everybody watching this.
Yes, I would say that sometimes individual responsibility is the only choice that you have. And it's good to explore yourself, because, like how they say that the relationship that you have with yourself often defines the relationship that you have with other people.
True.
So I don't think it's a bad idea to spend time with yourself, knowing yourself.
Yes, ma'am. It's like, some people elderly always say, you came alone and you'll go alone. So it's you that matters. It's you that important. So, you know,
Well, it definitely does, Upasana, but I think it's also important to maybe look at it more on a spectrum basis, that we can't generalize this experience for each and everyone. Some people may really have to reach out for help. Some people may really need their families and friends. And some people may, like sort of be okay with themselves.
right.
So I think it's also important to realize that what kind of stress factors are present in an individual, with an individual, that make them comfortable or uncomfortable to rather enjoy their solitude. So I would rather say that maybe instead of chosen solitude, I think it's good to just work on yourself. And sometimes you can work on yourself by getting in touch with a professional, a friend, or someone you trust and love as well.
Yes.
So, yes.
Okay. So with that, we have come to the end of our interview. Thank you so much for being with us. And is there anything that you'd like to tell? Because I believe that most of my audience is teenagers, and is there a parting note that you'd like to go with?
Well, yes, I think I would like to say that we are seeing increasing millennial burnout among a lot of youngsters, which means that how younger people are facing burnout at an earlier age as a result of increasing isolation, as a result of wanting perfectionist approach in their work in life. and just a routine struggle that comes as a part of their lifestyles as well. With increased social media use and technological use and digitalization of our lives, it definitely has created, I think, a lot of distancing among people. And one thing that I would like to impart and leave with all the youngsters of today is that no matter how much we evolve and no matter how much we grow, but it's very essential to keep in touch with our own people. It's very essential to keep in touch with ourselves as well. And hopefully, when this pandemic comes to an end very soon, we all will wait to meet each other and realize the importance of the physical presence of our own people and the community in general as well. So I look forward to a day and a time where technologies and digital devices will not have the whole and sole importance of being in connected with people.
Yeah, I agree, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. I look forward
Thank you,
to
Upasana.
talking to you soon.
Okay.